Okay, everyone, welcome to the Upptic hosted webinar on Web3 Games Growth. We have three amazing panelists joining us today. We'll go and introduce each of our panelists joining. We have Jeff Zirlin, aka Jiho. Jiho is the co-founder of Mavis, the creators of Axie Infinity. Axie is the #1 NFT game by DAU, marketplace volume, and cultural impact. As growth lead, his mission is to grow the size and strength of both the community and economy. Upcoming goals include the seamless global launch for Axie Infinity Origins, a real-time turn-based card battler where the players use their 3 strongest Axies to defeat opponents, win stars, and compete for the everlasting glory in the arena. Next, we have Yusuf Goolamabbas. Yusuf is the group CTO of Animoca Brands. He's also involved in the company's marketing and product development strategy. At Animoca Brands, Yusuf has been formulating the growth and marketing strategies and has brought in Web3 marketing partnerships for different subsidiaries and projects. Passionate about NFT, blockchain, and gaming, he's experienced in transitioning free-to-play games to play and earn games. He has worked on multiple Web3 titles such as Benji Bananas and Crazy Defense Heroes. And then last but not least, we have Meg McWilliams, COO and co-founder of Arrivant, a gaming studio focused on creating the next era of social gaming by building from the ground up with a community of 30,000 player collaborators. She has a proven track record in shipping cutting-edge XR experiences for brands like AT&T, Wall Street Journal, and Firefox Mozilla. Her work has been featured at some of the world's most prestigious festivals and institutions, including Sundance, South by Southwest, LACMA, and the John F. Kennedy Center. And then lastly, I will be your host today. I'm Warren, the co-founder and chief growth officer at Upptic. At Upptic, we provide a growth marketing platform and cross-disciplinary experts to empower our partners with everything they need to scale their games profitably. And Upptic has fully immersed ourselves in the emerging market of Web3 games, and we're heavily focused on both the unique challenges and unique opportunities of this sector, which is some of what we're going to dig into today. Okay, so Web3 gaming is still obviously in a very early phase. And one thing we found is there's very few teams out there that have really developed plans of how they can scale their games beyond the niche native audiences within Web3. For all of our panelists today, we've brought them here because these teams are all represented by folks who are very forward-thinking and have created, I'd say, strategies that have broke through or breaking early ground on some of the techniques for gaming growth in Web3. So we're really excited to tap into their knowledge today and have some conversation. Okay, so why don't we start with just sort of taking temperature on the industry. Jeff, why don't we start with you? How would you describe the current state of Web3 games, and where do you feel like we're at in the overall adoption curve?
Well, right now, we are in a period where there's consolidation. Things obviously got really hot and crazy, not just within Web3 games, but within gaming in general, right? Everyone thought that Roblox, right? The Roblox IPO was like super popular, and I think Roblox is now down 90%, right? So during COVID, everyone was forced to be inside. It kind of accelerated this trend where our digital lives, our digital mediums of entertainment were gaining rapid traction and a lot of importance relative to our physical lives and our physical means of entertainment. And now that trend has, kind of reverted to the old trend line, which is still right up and to the right in the long run, but it's just not as crazy. So right now, I think in terms of gaming, Web3 gaming, there's still a lot of building that needs to be done, and there's a lot of experimentation. But luckily, I think the industry was able to secure a lot of capital, right? A lot of resources to build the next set of catalysts. And we don't necessarily know what they are. It can be very difficult to predict in advance, but I think we're in this kind of holding pattern where teams are hopefully steady building and kind of figuring out what are the experiments that can get us to that next fundamental shift.
Thanks, Jeff. Megan, let's go to you next. I mean, where do you feel like we're at as far as the, kind of this initial rollout and adoption phase of Web3 gaming relative to where it's going?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with what Jiho just said as well. I think we're kind of in the phase that's similar to early mobile games, right? Mobile games didn't come out right away with the Fortnite on mobile, right? So I think that there's a lot of games that are in production and that are not quite mature enough yet for the bigger audiences. So I think we're still in the phase of adoption with early adopters and innovators. I don't think we've really crossed the chasm to the larger audiences just yet, but like you're saying, we're building right now. All the tools are being made that are going to make that possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what us at the team at Upptic are seeing is it feels like we're in the stage of like a lot of really rad stuff is being built right now. But other than Axie and some of the other early to market products like Sandbox, there's not a lot of things that have reached kind of mass cultural penetration. So there's, I think there's a stigma that there's not a lot of real games on market. And over the next year, we're probably going to see a lot more of these coming to market. Yusuf, I'd love to go to you next. Thinking about sort of the stages of a Web3 game going to market, on my end, I usually think of like there's like a kind of Web3 native marketing stage transitioning to a stage of more mass adoption as a game matures and becomes more accessible. But how do you and the team at Animoca think about sort of the stages of launching and growing Web3 games?
So, typically, like a Web3 game is generally does not come because a Web3 game is generally associated with play and earn gaming. There's kind of a token associated with it. It's all about like, thinking about like, hey, how are the tokenomics? How is the community invested and basically growing along with it, right? So it's more initially, you could say you use token emissions, or you kind of read to kind of like as a means of bringing audience in. Like, and we at Animoca Brands are kind of lucky that we have a portfolio approach, and that allows us to cross promote amongst different tokens. We're not a singular product company, right? And that allows us to basically say move one thing. We also use this to an advantage, right? So we've done things like in rev racing where we kind of incentivize on-chain activity to basically use that to deliver items, NFT items, right? So to get people to have digital ownership, digital assets. So it's kind of like people are saying, oh, okay, if you have this, you will get this type of thing, right? So we gave items to people who were like had a certain amount of YGG tokens, right? Or people who stake sand, they got a sand car and everything. So these are different growth mechanics, one could basically put in. I feel that right now, Web3 gaming still largely reaches the crypto native audience, and that itself is growing, right? So we've not reached, crypto as a mass market thing. It remain, it will, to reach mass market, you have to be kind of, you have to be on mobile, right? And unless the platforms have clear guidance, it's not, Web3 gaming isn't going to break out on mobile, right? So till then, right now, everybody's basically trying to grow the crypto native audience.
Yeah, fully agree with that. Clearly, like there has to be policy evolutions of the major platforms for mobile, and I know I think all the folks on this call have had our own pain points around figuring out those policies and how to work with those platforms. We're still fairly early in that journey, but I am optimistic that the next year is going to have some clarity around how we can bring Web3 games to mobile.
They know what it is, right? So
yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
They've heard about it, which is like to me like almost incomprehensible that we would be at this point. So to me, it's like, yeah, the fact that we're even able to speak to them, and they're able to like pick up or answer our emails, and even know that who Sky Mavis is, or what Axie is, or what an NFT is. To me, that's like so it's like it's crazy to me that's actually even something that's possible. So I think like we also have to have perspective of how far we've come in such a short amount of time.
Absolutely. Jeff, I'd love to stay on you for a second and dig into, I mean, it's no secret we're in the depths of the bear market for all things Web3 and crypto right now. All the folks on this call are still clearly building, investing, growing their teams. How do you factor in, you know, the inevitable volatility of this sector in running a Web3 business? How does it affect both your short-term and long-term planning?
Well, I think one of the things that has allowed us to prosper is that we were early and we just kept steadily building. We didn't slow down or speed up really. We just kept steadily compounding and improving our product, making sure that our community understands our mission. And, you know, sometimes onboarding is much easier. During the bull market, it's much easier. People will like the K factor and referral rates on your users increases because all of a sudden, all the people who are around your community, their friends, their family members, they're like, oh, wow, that person wasn't crazy. That's not just my weird cousin. That's someone that I can actually learn from, right? And that only happens during bull markets. So then all of a sudden their friends and family get involved and your user base, their ability to onboard skyrockets during a bull market. I think that's like one of the fundamental differences, especially around growth. In the bear market, the community is way less effective at onboarding. So what we try to do is we're training them, right? So they're now going through the Nas Academy Creator Program. We've secured spots, free education on how to make videos, how to tell a story, how to create a narrative, how to make thumbnails, things like that. So we're putting our community through that type of it's almost like vocational training during the bear market, getting ready for the next round of onboarding where people are ready to listen to what they have to say. In the meantime, I've also been thinking a little bit about, so in the last bear market, how did we onboard when nobody was interested in crypto, right? It was, well, actually, we had the free sample approach, right? Which was similar to how AOL spread, right? Which was actually the catalyst that led to the mass consumer adoption of the internet. The idea is that when you have something that people are skeptical about, but you know that it's good enough that if they try it, they're going to get hooked. And of course, like a free sample approach makes sense. So we did this with, I actually created the term scholarship, right? It wasn't what people think of as scholarship now. It was the idea that, hey, if you get a team of Axies, you're going to fall in love with Web3, you're going to learn about it, right? That's why we call it a scholarship, because you're learning. It's fundamentally a learning experience. And what did we do in 2018, 2019 to manually onboard people? We gave them Axies, right? So we gave all decentralized land holders Axies. We gave all Binance employees Axies because we wanted to go on Binance Launchpad. And right, so I think actually in the bear market, that is actually, if you want to onboard, I think it does make sense. You actually have to do it manually through like free samples. So that's something that I've been talking to my team a lot about recently.
Yeah, I'm smiling as you talk about that, Jiho, because I think a lot of the broader audience with the big burst on a market of limit break of Gabe Layton's from Machine Zone's company, new company. It's like the term free to own in Web3 is treated like a new concept, but clearly, projects like Axie have been doing similar concepts for early adoption for years. It's nothing new at the end of the day. I'd love to go next to talk about, so even though we are in a bear market, there's been a clear influx of a large amount of capital in the space coming on the heels of the last bull market. Megan, I'd love to go to you here to talk about this a little bit. So one obvious trend that we've seen, which I think is a good thing for Web3, is on the heels of this funding, a lot of brain drain from traditional tech and traditional gaming into the Web3 space. What are some of the other implications of this? I call it the last 2 years of new funding coming to Web3 gaming. What has that meant for your team? What does it mean for the space in the long term?
Yeah, so to your point, I think that there's a lot of good things about new influxes of capital, right? It gives people money to build and to experiment with new things, which is always amazing. But I also think that the huge influx of easy capital that we did see come through also had some negative effects, and that it created a lot of noise in the space, right? There were so many people that were creating these business models that had no sustainability and that were all just kind of based on hype at the end of the day. So I actually think the pullback that we're currently in is a good thing, because it's going to reveal a lot of the companies who are building sustainable business models and who are actually creating investment vehicles that are viable and that will get more capital in the next phase.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's start getting tactical. I mean, a big focus of today's session is to dig into some of the growth tactics that your teams have been exploring. Yusuf, let's start here with you. I mean, Animoca, I think, is one of the few companies in the space that actually has in-house performance marketing resources, and obviously your team has long roots in both mobile and traditional free-to-play, as well as early in the Web3 space. What are some of the growth tactics for Web3 that people should be thinking about if maybe they're in their first role or in being challenged with growing their first Web3 game versus traditional gaming?
So I'm going to basically say that Geo's approach of basically free samples is basically, one of what we've also seen is a big growth, right? So in few of our games, that's basically what we did, right? We made it very easy, like people mostly think of NFTs as very small, like 10,000. That's the narrative which the PFP world has basically taken over, and driven a lot of people into Web3. But for utility based NFTs, which are primarily around games, that number doesn't have to be, like, you can have it at a much larger scale, right? So how do you give away NFTs, and make, on what basis, right? Which allows people to basically say, okay, I own something, I can basically trade it off, right? And then even that trading volume can generate revenue for you. That's one of the growth techniques, right? And then if you have a mobile game, then what is your, what do you do when you have a free to play, mechanism, right? How does that allow for an earn mechanism, and why at some point you can basically say, okay, for now, I'm going to make it easy for people to basically earn. Then, so that basically gets people influx in. They're willing to do the level of education before you can basically say, okay, now we can apply whatever gated paywalls and other things. It's no different than a classic free to play model where you basically have an easiest onboarding. I mean, today in any Web3 gaming, right? Whether it's basically a game deciding to use a custodial wallet or a non-custodial wallet, that's one of the hardest challenges, right? How do you get even your first crypto to pay gas, right? So, I think a lot of games are experimenting with, how do you kind of abstract that away, right? And still, the jury's out there. So many different ways to abstract, but what does it mean, right, to do all that?
Yeah, Yusuf, you just used a good word, which is experimenting. Jiho, I'd love to go back to you here. I feel like, getting to know you a bit, you and your team have a very experimental approach, and you're in the midst of a big experiment, which is, reinventing Axie with a free-to-play onboarding system. And I know part of the vision there is growing Axie at the next level, making an easier on-ramp for new players to have their first experience. As you go into this next era of Axie with Origins, how do you think some of your growth strategies from what got you to this point will be evolving for that next phase of growth?
Well, one of the things is so I've never done, traditional gaming marketing, but I used to work on political campaigns, and I actually see Axie as a movement and rather than a product. And so a lot of the trajectory or the growth trajectory of Axie has actually followed, right, the trajectory of a blossoming political movement. In the early days, things were very grassroots. We had a small number of very passionate volunteers, and they got the party started. And they started, right, finding new missionaries and new converts for the cause, and it gradually started to grow. But now, right, it seems like, okay, we're garnering national appeal, national attention. We're starting to break into mainstream consciousness, and it's time for us to, right, start to harness strategies that can scale us and get us to the next level. It's like, okay, I'm starting to ask questions like, what are like the common characteristics, psychological characteristics of people that are good fits for the Axie movement, right? And then how do we find all of those people that exist in the world? I think so. Those are the types of questions that we're asking now. And of course, right, like having working with partners like Upptic, having way more detailed data on user behavior, preferences, demographics, things like that will all help basically drive this onboarding machine, which is needed for us to go from something with a lot of potential to something that could change the course of human history.
Yeah, you touched on a good aspect. I'd like to dig a little deeper with Megan, which is onboarding. You know, when I think for a lot of people coming from the traditional gaming and free-to-play space, a lot of the focus of marketing is getting the install, getting people in through the door. And there's definitely, you know, I found there's a lot more complexity. You have to take a prospective player on a much longer journey before they're really bought in Web3. And Megan, one thing I've really appreciated about your team at Arrivant with Project Loon is that focus on kind of that middle funnel of, okay, we have your attention. How do we, you know, go from just getting your attention to making you an invested, active, contributing member of the community? I know you developed a platform called Mission Control you're using for that. Could you expand a little bit on why that's important to you and your team's philosophy on, you know, that education portion of onboarding?
Yeah, so as you're saying, I think it's important to not just think about vanity numbers and how much you're growing. It's really for us about true engagement and how are people really understanding our world and being immersed into it. So like you were saying, we created Mission Control, which is a web-based kind of player hub, player dashboard that we funnel our community into so that they can learn more about our team, learn more about our world, and start getting introduced to the community. So basically the concept is that you come into Mission Control, it's free to use, obviously, and we send players on curated missions where they gain XP for learning about the game through things like scavenger hunts and other interactive missions where they answer surveys on which concept art they prefer, to introducing themselves in the Discord and trying to make new friends. So in everything, they're really kind of leveling up. And the cool thing is that while they're being onboarded into the space, they're also building out their identity in the ecosystem through the choices that they're making. And so we actually issue them what we call an Loon visa, which is a soulbound NFT, also to the fact of giving people things right when they enter the door, as Jiho and Yusuf were kind of speaking to. So they realize from the very beginning that they matter, right? That they have ownership in this ecosystem, and we don't just value them for what they buy, but also who they are. So what they do, and we really set the tone in that onboarding process, because the ethos of our game is really around community, social, that everybody matters in the space. So we put a lot of emphasis on that in the onboarding process.
Thanks, Meg. Next, I'd love to go to, I think, one of the more controversial aspects of Web3 Games Growth, which is the use of rewards of different kinds. Obviously, there is a sector of, but there's both perception and a sector of players in Web3 that are really in it primarily as a speculative, device for, what kind of returns can they get out of that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think there's aspirations of a lot of teams to have people playing first and foremost for the fun of the game in order to create sustainable economies. Yusuf, maybe we can go back to you here to start. Like, what do you feel like is a healthy usage of these kind of rewards, everything from tokens to NFTs? What do you view as like healthy versus unhealthy and unsustainable practices for rewards in Web3 games?
Well, unhealthy is always when you are emitting too much and you don't have enough sinks. That's always unhealthy, right? And tokenomics is basically a hard subject. You may intrinsically think something is right, but the market reality is different, and then you've got to adapt very quickly to it. Sometimes it may take much longer to rectify something than you anticipate, So I would say, while I understand that there is a perception that, look, Web3 gaming is all about basically just for people coming in purely from a money earning, from an earning perspective, I would argue that it's more for us at Animoca, for instance, we are all about true digital ownership, right? That is basically the main thesis. We want to get people to understand what is it that they achieve when they truly own their NFTs, and it's an interoperable metaverse, right? So as my colleagues in the sandbox have basically demonstrated, right? People who have, let's say, PFP collections are now able to materialize their NFTs as avatars and basically play play the sandbox as like a Bored Ape or a World of Women or Cool Cats, some of these things, right? So this is what we want to, I think, what I want to drive towards, having said that, there is always going to be a small sector of people who are going to jump from game to game looking for the highest yield, right? It's but maybe those set of users are also useful because they could be basically like, okay, I'm going to jump in to basically spread the word. It'll get you a small set of followers, to some extent, right? So I think that's my take on it.
Yeah. Jiho, how has your team's view of the usage of rewards evolved over time? Obviously, with Axie being the first huge breakout game in Web3, coming with being first comes breaking things along the way. So as your team has gotten more data and seen how the community growing to new levels has affected the economy and the usage of different kinds of incentives, how has this evolved for this next phase of Axie with Origins?
Well, we've definitely seen a lot of interesting behavior and learned a lot during the journey. I mean, I think that there will be phases to this economy, and there will be times where we're ramping up rewards, and there'll be times when we're balancing things and ramping them down. I think generally, right, like financial incentives for playing a game only make sense if you can see your game as something more than a game, something that benefits from gaining massive network effects where each user adds up more value than the last subsequent user, and that there is some benefit to having many players or many people within the ecosystem. For example, the way that we justify rewards in Axie's PvP system is that, right, like you're basically paying for player liquidity. And as game designers, you're basically trying, one of the goals to make your game fun is to have your players in flow state for as long a time as possible. And we know that, right? So you're paying for player liquidity, there's more people in the matchmaking queue because there are extra rewards. That then helps the matchmaking algorithm pair you with someone who's closer to your skill level, right? And flow state can be defined as like being optimally challenged at the edge of your abilities, not too hard, not too easy, right? And so basically our thesis was that, right, paying people to queue would basically make the game more fun because it would improve the matchmaking system. And that ended up working really well. And of course, right, over time, we had a system where we didn't have enough syncs because we had focused on, beating everybody to market, which I think was the right move. But we've shipped, a product that was still being very iterated on, where that was still very early. And so we didn't ship with things like vertical progression, runes and charms. Now we have, right? Runes and charms have led to a situation where now 10x more SLP the rewards token is being burned than actually earned through the game. So yeah, we've definitely learned a lot over the way. And there's been a lot of crazy volatility. I think that's natural for crypto. And yeah, I think we've also learned a lot about when using financial rewards makes sense. And also I think we've actually proved something really, really important, which is, yes, if you give people other options for things to do with these rewards tokens, they will choose to use them. If you give them the options, those options just have to be compelling, and it takes time to build out compelling options, right? Like the runes and charms, that's a very intricate system that if we rush to launch that during the bull market, could have been really, really bad. So,
right. Megan, I'd like to go to you next to talk about rewards. Though your team is probably the youngest on this call, you have some very experienced people on your team, including Ramin, who, if people don't know Ramin Shakrazad, is that his last name? He's like a legend in economic design and designing sustainable economics for games. So I know your team has thought long and hard about how to build sustainable rewards in the ecosystem. Can you just share some of your team's philosophies?
Yeah, and Vermeen is a wizard. He is amazing. He has a bunch of amazing papers online for anyone who kind of wants to dig into his philosophy on game economics. But basically, a big part of his philosophy and also why we founded the company together is because we shared a belief in that rewards don't actually just only have to be based in monetary value. They can be based in social equity as well, and really tapping into the community angle of the Web3 gaming space. And so this actually kind of goes back to the Alloon visa that I mentioned in Mission Control, where players are actually rewarded daily in Mission Control for their participation. But this isn't a reward that they can sell. It's a soul bound, which means it's tied to their identity. So they gain rewards through building their reputation, gaining new achievements, but within the community. And we think that we can have an unlimited number of those kinds of rewards because they aren't extracting value from the economy, which is really fun because I get to play around in that space. You know, Ramin only lets me do so many things that are going to affect the economy because he really guards it. But with stuff with social equity, we have a lot more room because every time we're giving out those rewards, it's just injecting more value into the ecosystem instead of being extractive. So for most NFTs, they store what you own, right? But you can think of the Alloon visa as it's storing who you are, and we reward you for that in our community.
Thanks, Meg. Next, I'd like to dig a little bit more into specific growth tactics. We've already talked a little bit about evangelism, and I'd like to go and explore a little bit more. Just one thing we found is like super valuable when appealing within the Web3 ecosystem is different kinds of social proof, be it respected influencers, communities that you are part of, and seeing what they're interested in. This is a very powerful lever. What are some of the ways that your teams have been leveraging community evangelists, social proof, guilds, influencers, kind of anything in this sort of like organic and high K factor type of growth? Yusuf, would you like to start here talking about community evangelism?
So I think it's I think the sandbox, as I said, Animoca Brands is a collection of different companies, and some of my colleagues, they, in particular the sandbox, they invested a lot in educated. Sandbox is a complex product, right? It requires creators, game makers, the whole ecosystem, right? So I think the level of investment they made into education and people kind of different, going up the chain, and Seb literally just traveling in the world, recruiting agencies and basically making them believe in the vision that this was going to be something bigger, right? That was very valuable, right? And then it's a halo effect, which kind of then leads to other projects also basically saying okay, if there's a mention about Seb, hey, I'm part of Animoca Brands, he basically links to that, then you have other executives who basically evangelize it, right? So it's a combination of, I think, top down, we were lucky that we were early, and with the portfolio approach of Animoca Brands, we have over 380 investments, right? It's kind of like a big cross promotion network going on, a classic ad network for those of us who remember them, where it's different communities promoting each other, right? And it's also different token communities, right? So if we in Animoca Brands run liquidity pools amongst many tokens amongst us. So if you have this token, then you can easily swap into that token on DEXs and basically get into that new game. That's been one of the growth tactics for us, right? Just making liquidity easier for many of our players.
Thank you, Yusuf. Jiho, I'd like to go to you here. Axie has some of the most passionate evangelists that I've seen in any community. And I see you and your team really playing with the incentives and infrastructure to support that. Can you speak a little bit to what you found really works for infrastructure to build those evangelists?
Well, first, I think the founders of Axie and Mavis, right? Many of us were CryptoKitty community members, and we had a lot of ideas on how, we're very passionate, actually, and at various points, I kind of believed in the product. that belief was later transferred to Axie and, you know, Web3 gaming in general. But so we went through the process of being a community members that wanted to contributing, and then feeling like we weren't being met at least halfway by the team building the product. So that was our first experience actually in crypto. That was my first experience in crypto, was like being a community member, wanting to contribute, and then feeling like I'd been betrayed. I actually felt very angry. One of my first motivations when I started in the space was just to destroy CryptoKitties and make it irrelevant. And so going through that process, I think really helped us understand, like, okay, these are very emotional community members that really feel ownership in these projects. How can we empower them? How can we make it so that what happened to us never happens again, right? Trung went through that on the development side, where he wanted to build something and you know, just kind of got disillusioned. Alex was actually a CryptoKitty mod, right? So we all had like different community-based experiences that I think that have informed our strategy, where we want to make sure that, right, like when people come in, they get excited. There's this window where, you know, unless their enthusiasm is met by the team or some sort of program or official recognition, they're gonna, like, that is just wasted potential. So I think that is what we've tried to do, is to make sure that, yeah, like, you know, everyone who wants to contribute can find a way to contribute. And I think one of the awesome things is that there are so many ways of adding value to a Web3 gaming project, right? Like there are so many community artists, there are people just by being good people and spreading positive atmosphere, they're adding a lot of value, right? Like one of the things that Axie is known for is like our Discord, right? A lot of our Discord convections have been, you know, without people even realizing, like the standards in Web3 gaming. Like everyone uses our formatting standards now, you know, the channels. And one of the things that we did in the early days around Axie Discord is like, yeah, like if we found people in the CryptoKitties or Decentraland Discord that were active, and seemed like they had a really good mindset, we would give them Axies and you know, have them engage, right? So recognizing that there's so many ways of adding value to an ecosystem than just like, I don't know, being a customer, which I think is kind of like a dirty word now, in some ways, right? Where like it's like empowering these consumers, making them owners, and giving them ways to contribute because they want to. Like that's the special thing, is there's a lot of people, when they get their first NFT, they just understand, like maybe they're a collector. They feel like they understand, like they get the feeling of ownership that they get when you have a physical ownership of something, or even ownership of a company, right? So yeah, harnessing that is really important, and it creates a special bond that, yeah, I think it's really unprecedented in a lot of ways.
And just staying with you for a minute, Jiho, other types of infrastructure that I've seen your team, you know, kind of double down on in recent months are, you know, around in-person events and you know, like AxieCon, which I know you just completed the first version of that, and esports. How have you found? I mean, these are you know, community levers that rhyme more with things we see in traditional gaming. How have you found that your community has reacted to esports and in-person, you know, cons and things like this?
Well, yeah. So as soon as the world started to open up after COVID, we're like, okay, like everyone has been hanging out online. Like, let's see if people want to hang out in person. I wanted to meet the community in person, and so I thought maybe other people might want to meet me and hang out with each other. And that ended up being true, right? So we did some small, like everything, we started doing some small experiments, some small meetups, and the response was like, you know, electric, right? And so yeah, we in terms of formal programs, right? Like we launched the Axie IRL meetups grant initiative, right? So now Axie community members can apply for funding to host grants, right? We did AxieCon in Barcelona, which is also in many ways an experiment, an important experiment, had over 1,000 attendees and got really great feedback, and the atmosphere was absolutely electric, right? The esports was special. It's just hard to describe, but yeah, over $1 million in esports prizes. We had, 1437, former member of Cloud9, Team Secret, took home the grand prize in an electric finals. We have the esports grant, right? So we have these initiatives where anyone can apply to be recognized, I think, which goes back to my earlier point, right? Is, okay, you need structures and systems and order to like basically bring that chaotic but beautiful energy of the community into a way that they know exactly what to do. Or they can basically raise their hand and say, hey, like, I'm really passionate about this. I'm not, and I want to help, right? So we have those programs on the esports and the physical side of things. On the creator side, right, we have the creator program, which is actually being run by Quest, right? So it's kind of like objective because like we have community members who are helping to grow it. Of course, they have experience in creator management and things like that, right? And we have Nas Academy teaching them how to actually make content, because we realize that sometimes the passion is actually harder to generate than the skills. The skills is just like, I don't know, teach them. So we wanted to basically bridge that gap where we have all these passionate content creators, but their thumbnails were ugly, and the way that they were telling the story of Axie, right? Like it could be refined, right? So upskilling that army of passionate supporters, right? So yeah, like I guess to kind of like merge the two is like, yes, you need to harness that raw, chaotic, electric energy of the community into like relatively clear calls to action for how they can contribute through different programs based on their skill sets.
Yeah, thanks, Chiho. One thing, so as we're digging into all these growth levers for Web3 games, I think it's important to maybe comment on what we're not talking about, especially considering I see a lot of folks in the webinar that are from the traditional free-to-play gaming world. And my background is in first, paid performance marketing, user acquisition, very data-driven, ads-driven. This is not really a lever that we see, in earlier stages of Web3 growth that is super, super effective. So, just want to touch on like why we're not talking about it. Not that it doesn't play a role. And, I think most of us on this call probably understand that as we get further along the adoption curve and start expanding beyond Web3 natives and Web3 curious, that some of these traditional growth channels that people are more familiar with, they will play a role. But in these earlier years of the industry, some of these other levers we've been finding more effective. One of the reasons that performance marketing is not super effective right now is kind of the lack of infrastructure for data and analytics around this. So I would like to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about data analytics for growing Web3. Megan, maybe we can start with you here. What do you think are the key metrics that a Web3 project or game needs to be paying attention to as they grow?
Yeah, and I think that this varies depending on which stage of growth your business is in, and we're pre-product, right? So I think the important metrics to look at when you're pre-product are based on engagement and what can you actually learn from these metrics that give you valuable insights that you can actually use to then build a better product for your players. I think that's the smartest thing that you can do. So I think figuring out what that is the first thing. So for us in Mission Control, right, we look at missions claimed. We're actually about to break 100,000 missions claimed in Mission Control, which is really exciting. And so we look at average numbers of missions claimed per user, retention rates, right? We're at I think a 64% day 12 retention rate in Mission Control right now. We look at what kind of missions they're claiming, because that shows us what are people navigating towards, what are they not liking. So that gives us a lot of insight to actually help us build a better product. And when you can learn about your player base, I think that's just the best way to do it. And obviously in Web3, we also get the added upside that we actually get to talk directly with our players in our Discord. So we don't just see numbers, we can actually see how are people responding to us, how are we learning about them as people, and then we get to use all of that data and inform what we built.
Thanks, Megan. Yusuf, obviously your Animoca as a studio has a deep background in traditional mobile games as well. How have you found that some of the nuance around KPIs and metrics that you care about has evolved with either hybrid Web3 free-to-play games or Web3 native games?
So I think for Web3 game, it's basically transactions, like the blockchain, number of blockchain transactions which are being done by a user, and more about it's about wallet analysis, right? What does, if you were to do a sample of your holders, right? What NFTs, what are the NFTs do they hold? So what are the communities they're part of? This is basically, that's what the blockchain enables, right? Basically transparency, right? I think marketers now need to understand that they need to they are able to query, like, hey, if my holders, if people holding my NFTs are also holding those NFTs, then that community is somebody you can basically tap into. So maybe they're coming in from there. Right. So these are some of, like, we could say, the querying mechanisms, so that's where the demographic basically comes into. It may be possible, depending on like the nature of the product, right? The thing, Web3 community generally likes to be is to be also pseudo anonymous, right? So there's a lot of, projects may get pushback, even though they may be required due to compliance for us to have KYC or whatever, right? That people may not be willing to give kind of identifiable data. So, you may have limitations in kind of doing like email-based drip marketing or anything, if those are not necessarily given to you, right? So I think it's a combination of what do I say, like if there is a token associated with it, then like what's the volume of the token, that's one metric, right? Because how is your game relative to emission, where are the sinks coming in? That's basically what's the trading volume on the token on dexes, or if you're on centralized exchanges. That's that's the state of the economy, right? Which basically not just you but other investors or even game players are basically looking at, because they want to understand liquidity. If they're going to earn something, can they basically, are they able to sell something out? Like, then that may make your game more attractive to them.
Yeah. Thanks, Yusuf. So we have about 10 minutes left. There's a couple of other topics I'd love to touch on. So I think we'll go, I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the broader group, and y'all can just chime in if you have something to add to them. Kind of rounding out this analytics section, does anyone have comments on sort of the technological and tooling opportunities? Like, what stuff that doesn't exist now that would really make your lives easier for measuring and operating growth with Web3 products? What are gaps in the market from a technological standpoint? I mean, one obvious one is we've seen the lack of mature like measurement providers that can accommodate, kind of the nuance of Web3 economies. Products, yeah, go ahead, Yusuf.
I would say stitching, you could say classical Web2 data, whether it's the form of, Web2 user identifiers with Web3 wallet data. That's basically which has to basically evolve, right? Teams can, kind of are building their own analytics stacks to a large extent.
Right.
And given the nature of like a lot of Web3 onboarding is via browser-based extensions, right? That's where complete breakage occurs, because you have no idea once a user jumps into that, it breaks a lot of things. So I think that's what I would like to see, right? There are definitely teams and vendors working towards it. I would say maybe I feel it's a year or two away, year and a half, I would say, till we can get something more robust. If it comes earlier, would be great. What else? I think also similar to platforms, right? Advertising networks are still restrictive on what can be promoted to them, particularly around blockchain gaming, Web3 gaming, so getting clarity on these type of, getting, you could say, more available inventory. That's basically one of the things I would be looking for.
Yeah. Thanks, Yusuf. I'd like to go next and make sure we at least touch briefly on, creative, which is a very critical function in, bringing any game to market. But just to the group, what have you seen? How are the needs of bringing a Web3 game market from a creative perspective different from marketing a traditional game? I mean, one of the things that we've really seen is like the theme of like education, and again, like kind of bringing deeper along the funnel. But any comments from the group as far as, you know, what you found is really important in the marketing creative and the messaging that you bring to both new and existing community members?
Well, I think it's like, so one of the things that we always ask is like, if we try to compete with traditional games, like toe to toe, like we're going to lose. Like, so what are the benefits that we can leverage that are totally unique to Web3, right? Like, what is our, if we're fighting Goliath, what is the slingshot comprised of, right? So, you know, some of the answers to that revolve around, right? It's like ownership marketing, right? It's like you're an owner, and therefore your duty, your like patriotic duty is to work alongside us. And then there's, right, like community is one of the benefits, right? How do we make people understand that like this is an ecosystem where you can come and you can network, right? It's like you can come in, it's like almost like, you know, people play golf. Some people play golf too because it's like, oh, they think it's good for their career, right? It's like, oh, like what if, you know, the networking aspect and meeting people from all across the world, you can even maybe, you know, there have been many people who have met their future business partners. Even business partners in something that's not related to Web3 have met in the Axie universe, right? So it's like, how do you basically make ownership a concrete benefit? How do you make community a concrete benefit? Because they can actually be abstract, right? That's actually why there was like the temptation, I think, right? So it's like, oh, like earning, right? Like earning is like, that's a very clear benefit that is easier to and less abstract than ownership, easier and less abstract than community. So maybe it was good. Maybe that was the benefit, the clear messaging that was needed for the bull market, and until we can really figure out like what is the way to communicate the benefit around ownership and community, because those are almost like features rather than benefits. Like, so what are the benefits of, right? Well, community is like, I don't know, make friends, right? Like that's kind of simple, right? Ownership, it's like be part of something greater than yourselves, right? Like be a I don't know, like be a business owner alongside all the other players of the game, something like that, right? Like, it's like, what are the clear benefits that we can point to that are unique and don't make us have to fight, right, the Supercells or the Scopelys of the world, right? And it's a similar thing with like analytics. Actually, that's how we think about it, is like, well, one of the reasons that we were able to succeed is like all the people who are very like analytics and data driven, they would have never gone into Web3 because there was no way for them to analyze the data. There was no data for them to analyze and figure out what to do, right? So we're like an intuitive company. We just kind of, right, like we, as users, and we built things that we ourselves would want to use, right? It's kind of more like an intuitive. It's more like, I don't know, Supercell versus Scopely, right? Supercell, they're like, yeah, like let's just build an amazing game. Because they were early, the KPIs, this is my understanding of how it worked, by the way. This isn't my specialty, but my understanding is that when Supercell came on, right, is like, oh, it was so much, it was such a novel and good product that it was like, yeah, the KPIs were really low because there wasn't much competition for a great, fun mobile game, right? But then it's like, oh, later on, because like, you know, the market got more saturated, then it was like analytics became much more important because, right, the games became a little bit more commoditized over time. So I think like also hopefully the thesis is that we're so early that, you know, the KPIs are also going to be really low, and so it's like let's move quickly, but and also like have an amazing product, and that will kind of like, then that will be the tailwinds.
Yeah. Man, there's so much more I want to dig into with this group, but the time has flown by. We really just have 3 minutes left, and I know the guests have a hard out. So we're just going to go accelerate here to the last question, which is, I'd love one thought from each of you on what it's going to take to facilitate us to the next phase of Web3 growth and adoption. And Megan, maybe we can start with you here. What is one thing that you think will drive us into that next phase?
Yeah, so I think that in general, there's kind of a big branding image problem with blockchain and with NFTs. There's a lot of misconceptions and just terminology that carries a lot of baggage. So I think the next big phase of growth will come with other larger companies using the technology and not labeling it NFT this or blockchain this, right? It would be like if you're playing Fortnite and you're like, oh, I'm playing a centralized database game. Like that sounds weird. What we need to get away from, it's a blockchain game, and the blockchain is just the framework. And I think that's going to come with these big companies bringing in the technology in a way that the consumer doesn't even really realize that they're using it. And that's really going to propel the next big phase of growth.
Yeah, very well put. Yusuf, let's go to you next. What is one key thing that will propel us into the next era of adoption?
As Bacon says, like abstracting the blockchain technology part of it. Like, so if your wallet is your identity into the blockchain, then you don't have to basically install a wallet. It's always there, whether you basically have it on your desktop or your mobile. It's basically there, and you can transport it from this. So that, I think, is going to require close cooperation with the platforms. Like, it has to be native. It has to be native to the operating system. For me, that will get it to mass market.
Yeah, just jumping on this, just something to add. So some of our new team members who joined who are not from the Web3 space said, even the term wallet, right? Saying, will you share your wallet? That's such a weird terminology to people who are not in the space.
Right.
We're like, scary, I don't want to share my wallet. Even little things like that, those words need to change, I think.
That's a good point. Jiho, quick closing thought from your end on one thing that will lead to the next era of adoption.
Well, I tend to think that these things are a little bit hard to predict, but come from like constant experimentation. I do think that finding seamless ways to get free samples to people will work. And I think like what we need to do is like I'm really interested in like very targeted approaches and figuring out ways to scale that, right? It's like everyone who has this NFT gets an Axie, right? If you maybe like, if you want to onboard people from Japan and right, like the big thing is Sybil resistance on like free stuff, right? It's like, yeah, if you're a Japanese citizen, have Japanese government ID, we're giving you an Axie, right? Stuff like that. I think that's what I've been thinking a lot about actually this week. So maybe it's top of mind for me. But it's an experiment that I think would work. Yeah,
it makes sense. Well, thank you all. I feel like we could easily spend another hour together, but I know our guests have to go. Yusuf, Jiho, Megan, thank you all so much for joining. The webinar today was brought to you by the folks at Upptic. Here at Upptic, we do all things to help games grow, and that includes both the technology and the services to do so. If you want to learn more about what we do, you can reach us at upptic.com. That's upptic.com. Thank you once again, Jiho, Yusuf, Megan, everyone who attended today. Hope you all have an amazing day, and we will see you on the other side.